Yeah.
Two, two.
It's up to you, really. Yeah, you better say, oh, there's no mute feature.
Oh, okay, just fine. Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks. Yeah.
No worries. We're just at the back, so you just wait.
You don't look sure.
It's all good. Let us know.
Yeah, thank you. What's the time? Okay, there's a couple more people coming in. How do you shut everyone up? How do you shut everyone up? Okay, hang on, let me just do this now. Without my head in it.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2021 Saki and Dockrill Memorial Lecture. I'm Professor Niall Barr, Head of Department of the Defence Studies Department, King's College London, and I will chair this session tonight. This lecture originated with the International History Group of the University of London as a means of paying tribute to Saki, and has now become a memorial for both Saki and Dockrill, who together had such a profound impact and influence on the War Studies Department and the field of international history. I'm pleased to say that the War Studies meeting room has been renamed the Dockrill Room, and this fine portrait of Saki, painted by Lola Frost, will be unveiled formally in the new year. I'll explain very briefly the format for this evening. We will hear from our distinguished guest speaker, followed by a period of questions and answers, and there will then be a reception to which you are all cordially invited. So now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, who first met the Dockrills in the late 1980s when they visited Harvard. He greatly enjoyed conversations with them, and he collaborated with them on many occasions through their shared interests in post-war US foreign policy. He has described Saki as a thoughtful and highly productive scholar and a gem of a human being, which I think says it all. Our speaker is the Distinguished Professor of History and Professor of Political Science and European Studies at Vanderbilt University. He's the recipient of a long list of awards and fellowships and a former president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. And he has also served on the Historical Advisory Committee of the Department of State. He's the author of many important works on the relationship between Europe and the United States in the post-war years, including his most recent work, Henry Kissinger and American Power, a political biography. And it is Henry Kissinger who forms the focus of his lecture tonight, entitled Achievements, Failures, or Crimes: The Kissinger Legacy in American Foreign Policy. Ladies and gentlemen, Please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas A. Schwartz.
It really is quite an honor to be able to give the Dockrill Memorial Lecture. Saki and I met, as Niall mentioned, when we both had just about finished our PhDs and had the opportunity then to be doing work on NATO, post-war rearmament, all of these issues. And I mourn her absence and her and Michael's absence. They were wonderful people. I want to talk tonight about this man, Henry Kissinger. This is his formal State Department portrait. And I had an alternate title, which is something of an inside joke. You have to know something of 1970s popular culture. But everything you wanted to know about Henry Kissinger, but were afraid to ask. There was a very popular book in the 1970s when Kissinger was at his height called Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex, and were afraid to ask. And Henry was part of that era. It raises the question, and this is the question I was always asked as I was working on it, why another book on Kissinger? And certainly this is a challenge. Neil Ferguson, whose work many of you I'm sure know, has come out with the first volume of his study of Kissinger, in which he tries to see Henry Kissinger as an idealist. Greg Grandin, from a very, very different perspective, in fact, essentially blames Henry Kissinger for everything that's gone wrong in American foreign policy since the 1950s. And Bob Brigham, someone else I know, did a recent book on Kissinger in Vietnam called Reckless, which also sort of centered on Kissinger's failings. There are more favorable books, one by Martin Indyk that just came out called Master of the Game on Henry Kissinger and Middle East Diplomacy. This is a fascinating book because Indyk himself was involved heavily in Middle East diplomacy, and so he brings to his study of Kissinger a sense of what the realities of the Middle East are like and what Kissinger had to deal with. In that sense, it's a combination of both history and, to a certain extent, biography and other aspects of the study. Three other books that came out at the same time of mine, The Inevitability of Tragedy by Barry Guin, who is an editor at the New York Times Book Review, is quite sympathetic to Kissinger. Stephen Rabe's Kissinger in Latin America is quite condemnatory of Kissinger, as is Bernd Greiner's Henry Kissinger, a biography that was written in German. My book is essentially a type of history through biography, Henry Kissinger in American Power. There was a sort of origin story that I like to tell, which is that I had done an article for a journal. The editor liked it and said there was this a new series of books that Helen and Wing were doing where they were going to try to teach larger concepts of American history through biography. Biography is a much more accessible way of conveying some important lessons. And they wanted someone to do something on U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century. And I asked around, I wrote up a prospectus, I asked around my advisors and the rest, most of which did not want me to do Henry Kissinger. I kept coming back to Kissinger as the one of the few lives that could get at so many of the issues of American foreign relations. And ultimately, it took me far longer than I expected, but I did, and it was much less of a short book than was also the intention. But I feel like that was the driving force, was to try to deal with that. I tell a story at the beginning of the book that when I first met Kissinger in connection with the book, he asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was trying to write a short book that would connect his life with American diplomacy. And he said to me, "But you will leave things out." And I did have to leave things out, but not as much as I thought. It turned out to be much longer. It is extremely hard, and in my book, there are a number of points at which I actually do say this, to make an overall assessment of Henry Kissinger today, or at least I found it difficult at times, especially with my colleagues. He is viewed on the left of the political spectrum in America with intense hostility. Bernie Sanders, whom I'm sure many of you know, in the 2016 debates with Hillary Clinton, called him the most destructive Secretary of State in U.S. history. And while I think that might appeal to Kissinger's desire to be number one, it's not exactly what he wants to be remembered for. There is an enormous amount of hostility toward Kissinger on Twitter. I don't tweet, but my daughters do, and they tell me when Kissinger's brother died this past year, there were all these hashtags, the wrong Kissinger, the wrong Kissinger. So that type of hostility, and there's also an intense hostility among many academics toward him as a figure who they see as the epitome of power, arrogance, and often crimes. I, in the end, took an approach that was fundamentally focused on the time Kissinger spent in government, assessing what he did in power versus his role after 1977. I acknowledge and have a chapter at the end of the book on his role since he was in power. And it's actually fascinating to think that it's been more than 40 years since Henry Kissinger had a position of great authority. And he has still played an extraordinary role during this time. But the full documentation and understanding of that role is something that will only come much later than most of us here will realize, given the nature of the time period and Henry Kissinger's own longevity. In fact, Kissinger's full papers won't become available until 5 years after his death, and he is 98 and still going. This is just the table of contents, gives you some idea of what I did in the book. As I said, the focus was on Kissinger's time in government. Some of the sources I used were the Kissinger papers, the memoirs and writings, which are available in part, Nixon library materials and other assorted collections. The two that most fascinated me, though, and probably caused me to take way longer on this study than anyone should ever do, was the Nixon tapes, which have now become mostly fully available. Most of you, although some of the younger people here might not know this, but Richard Nixon recorded his conversations and almost everything else that went on at the White House from February of 1971 to July of 1973. Because he did that, no successor to him has even gone near tape recordings. It was not perhaps as wise as Nixon thought. Nixon thought he was creating a historical record. It did end up hoisting him by his own petard on that scale. But the tapes are an absolutely fascinating and provide an insight, and I brought them along a little bit tonight to just give you a little bit of a taste of that. And the third source here is something that is at my home university, is namely the archive of the Vanderbilt, the television news archive. Vanderbilt has been recording the evening news in America since 1968, and particularly in the early period of the evening news, and I would say probably from about 1968 through around 1990, most Americans got their news and their presentation of reality from television, and this was quite crucial. And especially during this period, television news was largely the most trusted source. And so the manner in which Kissinger emerged on television news and the manner in which he came to be seen as essentially directing American foreign policy is, I think, an important source, and I've tried to bring along some of that tonight, too. My central argument in the book, and the reason I make an argument that there is something new to be said about Henry Kissinger, which is not always easy, was that Kissinger was indeed, while he was a foreign policy intellectual and advocate of realpolitik, the pursuit of a pragmatic and realistic foreign policy that promoted American security and the national interest defined fairly narrowly in military and economic terms, and largely downplaying moral and ethical considerations like human rights. This is not the wrong picture of Henry Kissinger, but it is very incomplete. And I argue for the centrality of politics. Kissinger is a political actor. His self-presentation was as an independent and nonpartisan expert on foreign policy, but he always recognized the centrality of politics and how deeply intertwined domestic and foreign politics were within the American system. Kissinger's skill with the media also enhanced his authority and symbol of foreign policy during the Nixon and Ford years. Some people of the time actually recognized this. One, the French foreign minister, Michel Joubert, who commented on Kissinger's taste for stardom, but that he was interested in politics, that he was a politician above all else, and calculated like one. Robert Hartman, who worked for Gerald Ford, also talked about his skill as a politician and argued that he was as good as one as all but a formidable few: Churchill, Roosevelt, Zhou Enlai, Golda Meir, and Nixon. And I think this sense that Kissinger's political concepts were important is the area I think I make an original contribution. And I think this contribution largely comes from the presence of the Nixon tapes, because they give us an idea of how foreign policy issues were truly discussed. I'll give a preview now for those of you who might find this talk a little lengthy. So if I lose you, you'll at least have heard what my main judgments are. I do think Henry Kissinger was extraordinarily consequential. The opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, its role in the Middle East, and even the reversal of U.S.-African policy. He also made mistakes: Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, Argentina, India, and Pakistan, East Timor. But I think many of these mistakes need to be understood in terms of what could be realistically done, or what control actually Kissinger had. I'm reluctant to go into the area of crimes. I think it's a description that stemmed more from Kissinger's own personalization of policy and media celebrity than from his real responsibility for these actions. So in that sense, I think one can reach a balanced view of Henry Kissinger without believing that he needs to be facing an international court of justice in the manner in which Christopher Hitchens, who was the most prominent figure in this regard, made. For many of you who are not familiar with the Kissinger story, he grew up in Nazi Germany, born in 1923. This is a picture of him and his brother, and then their mother there. He was affected by his German experience, but often discounted it and emphasized it was not central to understanding who he was. And he was quite careful on this during his time in power, and also often very sensitive to arguments that he had, in some sense, been scarred emotionally by his experiences in Nazi Germany. He did escape from Nazi Germany. His mother, I shouldn't say, I mean, they left, had American sponsors, and left in 1938 before the worst of the pogroms began in Kristallnacht in November of that year. One of the great sort of stories about Henry Kissinger is the fact that here he is leaving Germany as, in effect, a refugee, an exile, and yet going back as a conqueror a few years later in the uniform of the U.S. Army. He served in Army intelligence. His knowledge of German and Germany made him particularly noteworthy. It's also one of these things: service in the military in this context was a spring of great social mobility to millions of Americans. And with no American was it more so than with Henry Kissinger, who probably would have ended up an accountant in New York City had not World War II intervened. Instead, he, of course, would be with the American Army. He would liberate a concentration camp in 1945, and then he would serve as an administrator of a German city of Krefeld for a year before coming back to the United States. Kissinger's whole sense of ambition transformed itself. He had been at City College in New York, but now one of his mentors, Fritz Kramer, insisted that he go to Harvard, where gentlemen studied. Kissinger was an extraordinary student at Harvard, writing one of the longest undergraduate theses that ever was seen at Harvard, some 300 plus pages. It's one of the few Kissinger manuscripts that's not published. It led to the Kissinger rule at Harvard that no undergraduate thesis could be longer than 100 pages, which was still in effect when I was there. That was one of the rules of that was called the Kissinger rule. While a graduate student at Harvard, he created an academic journal that networked and allowed for the international exchange of ideas. He also developed an international seminar that brought Europeans to the United States, and then later Africans, Latin Americans, and Asians as well for discussions of American politics. Kissinger, actually, a number of his former students ultimately had quite prominent roles in places around the world later, and he would interact with them. He became an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller who was the liberal Republican when there were liberal Republicans, and he was governor of New York. And many people thought he would become president. Kissinger became his advisor and was linked to him from a very early time. And I think he got an instruction in politics in some ways from his time with Rockefeller. In 1958, Kissinger was one of the first defense intellectuals in the United States to write a bestseller, in this sense, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, in which Kissinger actually argued on the need for the United States to develop a capacity for limited nuclear war. It's actually remarkable to think about it now, but this was seen by many in the establishment as absolutely essential. I just want to show you a bit of Kissinger here. In particular, I wanted to show and just keeping in mind that this is from 1958, and this is Henry Kissinger's first television interview.
C-SPAN, proudly true to our mission for 40-plus years.
In 1958, Henry Kissinger appeared on a program called The Mike Wallace Interview. Mr. Wallace questioned Mr. Kissinger about relations between the United States and Soviet Union, the concept of limited war, and how to prevent a nuclear war. It's just under 30 minutes.
This is Professor Henry Kissinger, a military and political analyst with a revolutionary concept of nuclear war and a constructive concept for peace. He's a man whose ideas have prompted the highest officials of our government to re-evaluate our defense policies. We'll get his criticisms of our current strategies in war and peace in just a moment.
You're going to have to help me.
The Mike Wallace Interview, presented by the American Broadcasting Company in association with the Fund for the Republic.
You're going to have to help me
brings
come
you a special
to get
television
back there.
series discussing the problems of survival and freedom in America.
Good evening, I'm Mike Wallace. Tonight, we'll tackle the immediate issue that will decide the fate of our freedom, certainly, and possibly even of our survival. We'll discuss the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and the chances of war. Our guest?
Okay. I wanted to, I knew something would go wrong. I was hoping to be able to click on a particular comment that Kissinger made during the interview in which he talked about himself as a nonpartisan and someone who was independent of any political affiliation. And this was something Kissinger cultivated almost throughout his career, even when he became much more partisan and identified particularly with the Republican Party for a time in their foreign policy and with Richard Nixon. Even at this time, when he was working with Rockefeller, he tried to do this. But Kissinger also maintained links on both sides of the political spectrum. In particular, Kissinger in 1960s went to Washington briefly with the Kennedy administration, advising on Germany, despite his continuing ties to Rockefeller. But he was mistrusted by a number of people within the Kennedy administration and not given a great deal to do. He would come back in the Johnson administration, and he would actually get his first experience with trying to conduct secret negotiations, which he tried to set up in Paris in 1967. And he was involved in particular one of the secret negotiation efforts called Pennsylvania then. He developed ties to both Republicans and Democrats. And in the 1968 election, Kissinger worked for Rockefeller and was disappointed when he was defeated by Richard Nixon in the Republican primaries, but he stayed involved with the Paris negotiations, and he warned Nixon that there would be a bombing halt. In fact, Nixon would then later tell the South Vietnamese not to come to the negotiating table, something that President Johnson thought was treason. In fact, of course, I think the South Vietnamese wouldn't have come anyway, since they were worried about being sold out by the administration. This is something, though, of one of the early criticisms of Kissinger was that he played both sides of the fence. And this is both a criticism, but it's also it also gives you some understanding of how his own prestige was such that he could interact with both Republicans and Democrats, so much so that Hubert Humphrey, who lost to Richard Nixon in 1968, would later say that he would have appointed Kissinger as National Security Advisor, just as Nixon had. This is Nixon and Kissinger in the television news. I'm not sure what's going to happen here, if this will come up. I wanted to show you just his introduction in the Vanderbilt TV archive. This may, let's see what happens here.
$50.
No.
President-elect Nixon today named Dr. Henry Kissinger, the German-born Harvard professor, as his White House policy advisor on defense and foreign affairs. In the planning of foreign policy, Nixon said he intends to seek the advice of experts in allied nations. Dan Rather reports.
Kissinger long has argued that the U.S. must use its power more subtly. He is more expert about Europe than Asia, believes no strictly military solution is possible in Vietnam, but opposes a unilateral pullout. He was asked about reports that he is a hardliner on Vietnam.
Well, I have been expressing my views publicly on international affairs for the last 15 years, and I have tried to avoid labels like hard and soft and express my best judgment on the substance. Therefore, I find it very difficult to characterize myself.
As for the idea of actively soliciting the advice of private foreigners, Kissinger named Alistair Buchan of London's Institute for Strategic Studies as an example. Mr. Nixon was asked if all this might not be resented in his State Department.
Of course, the Secretary of State is the chief foreign policy advisor to the President of the United States. As far as the government is concerned generally, there must be the very closest relationship between the Secretary of State and the White House staff. Dr. Kissinger is keenly aware of the necessity not to set himself up as a wall between the President and the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense.
A one-time Whittier College end, Mr. Nixon took time out to greet All-American footballers, Ohio State's Dave Forey, Georgia's Bill Stanfill, Notre Dame's Terry Hanratty, and Southern Cal's O.J. Simpson. Tomorrow, Mr. Nixon is expected to name as his science advisor Lee Dubridge, president of California Institute of Technology.
I just want to click off on that. Okay. You do find funny things in the television archive, references like that to someone who becomes famous much later, and all of that. That clip always fascinates me because of a number of things. One is seeing Kissinger on camera that early, recognizing sort of some of the limits, but also seeing in a way how he was playing this sort of avoiding attempts to define me. Also hearing Richard Nixon say that he was not going to set up a wall between Kissinger and the Secretary of State, and knowing, of course, that full blast, that's what he was going to do, that Kissinger was, in effect, brought into the administration to bring foreign policy into the White House and to effectively exclude the State Department from the most important decisions, because Nixon wanted to use foreign policy, both because of his own belief in the importance of it, but also for political reasons. He wanted the credit for foreign policy achievements to go to him, not to the Secretary of State or to the State Department. And this was an important part of Kissinger's role as National Security Advisor, was in effect creating, bringing foreign policy under the control and domination of the White House, both to allow for speed and secrecy in the carrying out of foreign policy. The first 2 years of the Nixon administration were not terribly successful. Vietnam was not ended as quickly as Nixon hoped. Nixon hoped to get the Soviet Union to intervene. He hoped to convince the Vietnamese that he was willing to use force, only to find that this divided his cabinet, and the scale of the anti-war movement in the United States made them fearful of a terrible domestic unrest. He had relatively little progress with Russia and China during this period. The Nixon doctrine he did proclaim about the retrenchment of U.S. power. The administration failed in Chile to prevent the election of Salvador Allende. They had some success in the Middle East, but Kissinger himself, called up by a reporter about the Middle East situation, began the statement in his classic sort of humor, saying, well, you can't lose them all. And that, I think, was a reference to some of the difficulties the administration had. Kissinger, from the very beginning, though, crafted an image with the media. He was on the cover of Time magazine within a month of the beginning of the administration, and that would become a frequent area. And this was a period of time, and I feel like I should say this now, when magazines like Time and Newsweek really set the agenda in the United States in ways that it does not exist now. That's what you're continually aware of is how different the media environment was then, both in terms of the dominance of national news, but also of certain magazines and key newspapers in setting the agenda for the country. Kissinger also developed the secret swinger. This is one of the more bizarre aspects of his career, which was this dating beautiful women and being sort of in the fashion pages, the society pages, at first of the Washington Post, but as his prominence grew, also in other major news magazines. And so the idea that Kissinger was this ladies' man and was the most colorful figure in the Nixon administration quickly emerged. The Republicans suffered deep losses, though, in 1970, and even though they gained a couple of seats in the Senate, their margin in the House failed, and Nixon thought he might be a one-term president, and he considered, he talked to his advisors about the need to highlight Kissinger, who he thought could be a key figure in making the administration more politically strong because of the media favoritism that had already become clear in the way in which so many journalists regarded Kissinger. Kissinger resigned from Harvard. There is a news clip I have of this. I'm going to skip this one just to allow me to move a little faster. Nixon, in early 1971, engineered the invasion of Laos, which was a complete military failure, in intelligence. But Nixon gave a speech in which he made the case that this was an enormous success. And he tried to argue that this would allow him to continue Vietnamization. Kissinger immediately called him at the end of the speech, and this is one of the things you do get from the opportunity of the tapes.
Dr. Kissinger?
Yeah, the President? Yeah, Henry. This was the best speech you've delivered since you've been in office. I don't know. I think November 3rd was better, but we will never have a moment. We'll never have a moment like that again. Well, the November 3rd speech was not well delivered, Mr. President, if you remember. Yeah. It was a powerful speech. Yeah. This one was really movingly delivered. And I don't know whether you saw the commentary afterwards. Of course, I don't look at the commentary. Well, I don't care what the bastards say. Well, but this is so amazing, John. First of all, no one was fly-specking it. John Chancellor was very favorable. Everyone is saying a strong man sticking to his guns, carrying out his policy, not being driven off. Dan Rather, very positive. Marvin Kauff, very positive. The only guy who was fly-specking it a little bit is the Pentagon correspondent, who had been... How about Howard Smith? How'd he do? He would not. At least I didn't see him. Yeah. I'll say one thing, this little speech was a work of art. I mean, I know a little something about speech writing, and by the time we got it down in that little conclusion, I think that was done, and it was no act, because no actor could do it. No actor in history could have done that well. I thought that was done well. I don't know. I didn't know that November 3rd was better, but, yeah. But did that come across? I mean, it was the President. I had, after all, heard it before. Yeah. I had a lump in my throat when I heard it. Well, you know what? You brought a lump.
The conversation goes on. What's fascinating in that, of course, is that Nixon doesn't want to know what the bastards say about him, but he wants Kissinger to tell him what the bastards say about him. And this was part of their relationship, was, of course, the one in which Kissinger continually flattered the president and would argue in his memoirs that this was necessary because of Nixon's deep insecurities. And you hear some of that in this speech, although Kissinger also sort of says, well, you didn't do a good job on that one, but this was the best. This was the best. And this speech, or this particular comment would go on, and you'd see Nixon's anger toward his cabinet and other people who did not call him up after the speech the way Kissinger did. So Kissinger in some ways insinuated himself with Nixon through a sort of excessive flattery and the rest, but also I think Nixon, and one of the things I argue in the book is that Kissinger is very much Nixon's creation, and he will give to Kissinger a scale of authority that will make Kissinger and allow for Kissinger actually to outsurvive Nixon, which is fascinating. I had another one here, I'm going to skip it on now, but it was a reference to ping-pong diplomacy, which dominated the news. And what was clear in this conversation particularly was that Kissinger and Nixon followed and were quite attentive to what television was saying about them, what was being commented on, and they were enormously impressed with the coverage of the ping-pong diplomacy and the beginnings of the China opening, which they saw as an enormous possibility for that. And in fact, Kissinger and Nixon, and I would argue this, and I make a case in my book, that as much as there were geopolitical realities involved with the opening to China, there were also American domestic political realities. In effect, Nixon stole an issue from the Democrats who were pushing for the opening to China, but he stole it in such a way that it captivated the American people. And the China opening was an extraordinarily popular thing at the time. This has gotten a little obscured recently because there's been an attempt by some people to revise history on this because of China's increasing prominence and some of the fears about China. But the opening to China in 1971 was thought of as an enormous stroke of genius. And it sent Nixon higher in the polls, and it also led to Kissinger being seen as a crucial part of this, of the teamwork. Not long after the China issue was developed, Kissinger ended up on the cover of both magazines in 1972 when Nixon announced that he had been having secret talks with the North Vietnamese. The announcement of this was also designed for political reasons because the Democrats were criticizing Nixon for not offering the North Vietnamese things that Kissinger had been offering in the secret talks. And in a way, this was Nixon's response to it, but it also highlighted Kissinger's role. I have a TV clip, which I'm going to skip here again in the interest of time, but in it, Kissinger's role is highlighted again by CBS News and Walter Cronkite, which was the major news source. And Kissinger was also seen speaking, but you could not hear his voice because the Nixon administration, until late in its first term, thought that Kissinger sounded too much like Dr. Strangelove, and that having him speak audibly was actually a dangerous thing and might lead people to think that somehow he had this power. As they would have said, it didn't play in Peoria. What I argue in the book is that, in effect, the successful trip to China, 1972 was the political year for Nixon. And the successful trip to China, which was choreographed for television news, we actually have this, you could see how much the Nixon administration emphasized making sure there were events for the morning news and for the evening news all around the television coverage of it, but also that it got enormous sway, so much so that Gallup did a poll shortly after Nixon's trip, which found that more than 90, I think it said 98% of Americans, it might have been 95, but to have that many Americans aware of any event at any particular time is extraordinary. Most Americans are usually tune off politics and the rest, but the Nixon trip to China got enormous attention, and it was central to the politics of 1972. Nixon also had his successful trip to the Soviet Union, despite the fact that he engaged in more bombing of North Vietnam in response to the North Vietnamese Easter offensive, which attempted to topple the South Vietnamese government. And then in October, Kissinger was able to appear for the first time on camera and audibly, announcing that peace is at hand at a press conference on October 26, 1972, in which Kissinger would make this announcement that even though, of course, at the time, they did not yet have the South Vietnamese agreement to go along with the concessions they had made. I will play this because it gives you some idea of how central, even in foreign policy issues, immediately the question went to domestic politics.
Hello? Hello? The President? Well, Henry, I understand that the
All the free news shows were about Vietnam, and I wonder why.
Colson calls me, and he thinks that we've wiped McGovern out now.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought you'd be interested. I was in West Virginia and Kentucky, and I played it even a little more low-key than we talked. You know, I said that based on the progress that has been made to date, I can say with confidence tonight that I believe we will achieve our goals. You know, just like that.
What's the response?
They practically take the roof off. A peace with honor and not a surrender. That's all I said. Not another thing. And then
Again, the idea, even though, of course, the peace settlement was also something they sought for geopolitical reasons, the timing was carefully timed to American politics and getting the credit for that. Time magazine made the two men of the year, when this was before they went to person of the year. They were men of the year at the time. This irritated Nixon to no end. Nixon was really quite angry that he had to share credit with Kissinger, but in effect, he had actually made Kissinger into this sort of central figure. So much so, of course, that a year later, when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, it was given to Kissinger and Le Ducteau, not to Nixon. This was something that deeply irritated Nixon. I'm going to skip this particular Nixon reaction. It's pretty foul-mouthed, but it gets into his anger about how Kissinger was, in fact, being presented. The peace treaty, of course, would take more than 3 months still to work out. There would be the Christmas bombing, which elicited outrage from around the world. But Kissinger still received credit when the signing of the treaty took place. And this is him in January 1973. Now, this has led many historians to argue that effectively what the Nixon administration was doing was simply creating the opportunity for a decent interval between between the end of the war and the end of South Vietnam. I had the opportunity, and I think this one I will try to play. Okay, can you break it so I can see it? This is Kissinger appearing at a State Department conference in 2010 on the announcement of the last of the documents were declassified from the Vietnam War.
Thank you very much. I must point.
The volume is not good on this, I'm afraid.
I hold one record that will be hard to exceed.
Okay.
During the period that I was both secretary.
I'll skip this for the time being. What actually happened was I was able to ask him the particular question. That's all right. Go back. Could you go back? Yeah. I was able to ask him the question, and Kissinger responded in probably the closest recognition of this, that indeed, while they did tell foreign powers that they recognized that the South Vietnam might not survive and that they were getting out, they needed to get out with some degree of honor for the United States preserved, they still hoped that they might be able to keep a government there, but that they recognized that it could not be sustained indefinitely. Technology. Are we back? Okay. Apologies. No problem. I always expect this. And I have added a lot of this because I sometimes think that this does help keep people's attention. You're not just hearing my voice. You hear Henry, you hear Richard Nixon, you hear Walter Cronkite, but sometimes it becomes very difficult to do this. So, from the current slide. Okay. Subsequent to this, the peace treaty was, of course, Watergate and the collapse of Nixon's authority. In my book, I argue, in effect, that during this period, Henry Kissinger became all but president in name for foreign policy. He directed American foreign policy, enjoyed this type of media coverage, particularly from Time, but also Newsweek and others, and he redirected his efforts into the Middle East. And the Martin Indyk book, I think, gives you some idea of why that is seen as far more lasting a part of Kissinger's legacy than other aspects, particularly Vietnam was. Kissinger crafted the ceasefire that ended the Yom Kippur War of October of 1973. He received enormously favorable coverage of his efforts as a peacemaker during this time, and this was the same time as Nixon fired Archibald Cox, and the first demands for the impeachment of Nixon were coming. So there was this sort of bifurcation of Nixon's collapsing authority with Kissinger's growing authority in the public. Kissinger then negotiated disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. The particular one that I won't show right now about Syria had John Chancellor announcing on NBC News that Henry Kissinger did it. That was the beginning of his framing of it in June of 1974. Kissinger ultimately established the United States as the honest broker for Middle East peace. He pushed the Soviet Union out of its realm as a power, particularly by switching Egypt from a Soviet ally to an American ally. And in effect, he set American policy for decades in the Middle East. And this was quite strongly suggested. The Newsweek Superman bit gives you some idea of how that looked. The Mideast miracle, also in the midst of all of this, when Americans were paying close attention to the Middle East because of course, increasing oil prices, something that one sees to this day. Nixon resigned in August of 1974, and this began a period of time in which Henry Kissinger now became the target of critics. Kissinger had enjoyed a certain immunity during the period of Watergate, and when Kissinger threatened to resign at one point during Watergate, everyone said, no, don't resign. We can't afford to lose you, sort of setting the stage for the fact that people did feel Nixon could resign, and he did. Gerald Ford comes into office, and when asked about his foreign policy, he says, well, Henry will take care of that. And Kissinger is, in effect, continues to have dominant influence on foreign policy. But he is challenged considerably by the Democratic Congress of 1974. There's also growing opposition to détente among conservatives, and especially on the Reagan wing of the Republican Party. Liberals challenge the morality of policy toward dictatorships like Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. And then there's the collapse in Vietnam in April of '75. Kissinger comes under extraordinary and quite strong attack during this time. There is this TV report, which I will try to show, just because of what it captures, I think.
Tom Gerald, ABC News, Jakarta.
We'll have more from Jakarta later.
Although this has been a working trip for Secretary of State Kissinger, perhaps it seems more like a vacation to him, for in some respects, Kissinger now appears to be more popular abroad than he is at home. Barry Dunsmore explains.
With the conclusion of the Israeli-Syrian disengagement agreement in June '74, Kissinger was at the height of his career, and Newsweek made him the ultimate pop hero. The same magazine this week is hinting of his demise. This week, Kissinger has been in China. Chairman Mao gave him the warmest greeting. The Chinese like him. The Russians respect him. The Egyptians and Israelis will only deal through him. But here in Washington, it's been another week of Kissinger under attack. Yesterday, the Senate Intelligence Committee issued a report on the 1973 coup in Chile. While not finding the CIA specifically involved, the report talks of a policy which, quote, created the atmosphere, unquote, for Allende's removal. Henry Kissinger directed that policy. Earlier this week, former Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Zumwalt was before a House committee, claiming Kissinger was hot.
Thank you. The report goes on and makes the point that Kissinger might be threatened in his stature. Of course, that didn't happen. Kissinger remained. He was so vital to Gerald Ford that despite the fact there was a critique from the left by Jimmy Carter, which stressed the need for a more Wilsonian and idealistic American foreign policy, a critique from the right by Scoop Jackson Democrats, conservative Democrats, and Ronald Reagan Republicans, and the influence of Congress, Kissinger's realism was under attack by all of these forces. Kissinger gave a series of speeches in which he tried to essentially make the case for his approach as something like the Goldilocks of foreign policy between the isolationist attitudes of many Americans and the sort of idealistic Kennedy-type approach of foreign policy. And even though, and this is one of the things I try to correct in my book, there is the argument that somehow he was repudiated in 1976, Kissinger never lost the support of a majority of the American people for the type of foreign policy he was engaged in. I could say a lot about Kissinger in retirement, and perhaps that'll come up in the Q&A. Kissinger remained a powerful figure. During the Carter administration, he was effectively shadow Secretary of State. I use the British term in that sense, that he was really seen as having that much authority. He was, though, beginning to be attacked, particularly the British journalist William Shawcross in his book on Cambodia attacked Kissinger, as did Heller in a fictional account. During the Reagan years, Kissinger would be an informal advisor on Soviet Union and Middle East, and chair the Central American Commission. But because right-wing Republicans suspected his détente policy, he never had a formal position within the administration. His protégés would influence George H.W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, and Lawrence Eagleburger, who had worked closely with him. And he would speak to George H.W. Bush. But George H.W. Bush actually did not particularly care for Kissinger and kept him at a bit of a distance. He was an occasional advisor to Clinton, to Bush II, and to Obama. There was the publication of Hitchens' trial of Henry Kissinger and the increasing controversies about some of his decisions in the past. He was initially appointed to head up the 9/11 Commission by Bush, but resigned quickly when it was clear that he would have to reveal the clients of his international consulting business, and he did not want to do that. He became very wealthy as an international consultant. He has continued to write books. His book on China is a particularly interesting account of and his own thinking about Chinese development. His book on world order, and then this past month he released a book co-authored with two other authors on artificial intelligence's implications. So he's still going. He did try to create a softer image with a number of ads in the 2000s. One had him in Yankee Stadium. Another had him on a plane reading The Economist. The Economist had him as a figure there. Let me try to assess. I've gone over already, and I clearly can do this. And I can talk about Kissinger forever. I think one of the central things, and this is one of the points I make in the book, is that what Kissinger's career illuminates is this connection between domestic and foreign policy in the United States that does create a challenge for anyone in a field of policymaking. Kissinger actually had relative success at this balance for a time, and he and Nixon were able to craft a foreign policy that won popular approval and that also contributed both, I think, to a certain geopolitical stability as well as to his electoral success in 1972. I argue, though, that Kissinger was more of a tactician than a strategist, and this is probably something that does not appeal to his own sense of himself. I think it's closer to reality that he was able to react to crises better than he was, in a sense, to design things, particularly on the Middle East, for example. Kissinger once told a group of Foreign Service officers in 1977, when you are in these positions, you can't really reflect about their meaning, because as you rise through the policy process, your actions become really more and more like those of an athlete. You have to react almost instinctively and have to worry about the significance of what you've done later. And Kissinger, in a sense, I think, did come to react and reflect on the significance of what he had done. But in many senses, many of these decisions were quite tactical rather than, I think, embracing a larger strategy. Kissinger did come, by the end of the time he was in office, to recognizing the limits of American power. But at the same time, he also contradicted that. And I write this in my book, that Ironically enough, Kissinger's lamentations about American foreign policy and his critique of exceptionalism were undermined by his own position and actions as Secretary of State. His phenomenal ascent as an immigrant and Jewish refugee to the heights of power seemed as much a testament to American exceptionalism as a criticism of it. Kissinger's willingness to advise presidents to use American power abundantly, from bombing in Vietnam, mediating in the Middle East, and playing off the Soviet Union and China, hardly seemed to call for its limitation. As the British ambassador, Peter Ramsbottom, observed in 1976, Kissinger's Spenglerian pessimism about the decline of the West and the congressional restraints he faced coexisted with his continuing search for new areas like sub-Saharan Africa to exercise American power. Just as Kissinger could dismiss the importance of personal diplomacy except when he himself was at the center of it, so too did his lectures about foreign policy and the limits of power seem contradicted by his own career and behavior. I stress also in the book Kissinger's personalization of foreign policy, his emphasis on how diplomatic and political issues related to him personally. And I think it's one of the more revealing aspects in studying his behavior in office. As much as the theorist in Kissinger stressed the role of impersonal national interests in determining the foreign policies of state, Kissinger, the policymaker, saw issues through a personal lens. To the Chinese, he was the symbol of their new relationship with the United States. To the Russians, he was their ally against the nefarious Henry Jackson and critics of détente. To the Chilean and Argentinian dictators, he would hold off the congressional liberals and their human rights demands. And to the Israelis and the Arabs, he was their honest broker, even as he told each how much he sympathized with their claims. It's interesting, it's a British analysis that I found that in some ways provoked this in the Foreign Office records. They were meeting, Kissinger was coming to Britain in March of 1974 for a meeting, and in this analysis it mentioned, despite his high intelligence and his conceptual approach to foreign policy, by no means do all Kissinger's actions form part of a coherent master plan aimed at promoting the United States' political advantage. Mood, emotion, and the circumstances of his own background, he is the first immigrant to ever become U.S. Secretary of State and is very conscious of the dignity of his office, are powerful conditioning figures. They on occasion lead him to personalize his dealings with foreign countries and to inflate specific issues into the touchstone of relations with them. Along with all of this, I would also argue that Kissinger's skill in dealing with the media is something also that's really clear from understanding. He spent an enormous amount of time briefing journalists, making sure, talking to columnists, making sure that the policies was explained, being the background source. And this occupied a large part of his time. And it's actually quite extraordinary to see how much time was spent on the media aspect of his role. Kissinger is also something of an unapologetic Cold Warrior. Many of you might be aware of Robert McNamara, who repented on Vietnam. Kissinger has never repented, and in fact, in the picture that you briefly saw of Kissinger and at the State Department, it was a picture that I never thought I'd see. It was Kissinger in front of the flag of the United States and the flag of the communist dictatorship in Vietnam. And even in that particular context, Kissinger still regretted the fact that the communists won and believed that the United States should have done more to preserve South Vietnam. So I think this is one of the reasons why he is particularly seen by many as a target of things. And in many ways, many of his policy choices were not unlike that of his predecessors or successors, but they reflected, I think, the dilemmas of any great power, but because Kissinger has so personalized the foreign policy process, he has attracted, I think, a great deal of the venom and hatred toward some of those decisions. I'm going to close here the way I closed in my book. Henry Kissinger was and is a complicated man. Brilliant, devious, suspicious, arrogant, insecure, obsequious, paranoid, thoughtful, tenacious, domineering, vulnerable, direct, deceptive, insensitive, eloquent, petty, turgid, witty, thin-skinned. In short, the polytropos which Hans Morgenthau recognized when Kissinger was at the height of his world fame. Kissinger is also, I think, a truly significant historical figure and symbol of America's international power, a man who played a critical role in American foreign policy during a transitional era and whose long life after his government service have allowed him to shape both the understanding of that era and America's subsequent history. Henry Kissinger both exercised and symbolized 20th century American power, leaving a legacy which 21st century Americans will debate for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Thomas, for that fascinating talk. And now we can open the floor up for some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I'm a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst who had responsibility for covering ex-Soviet states. I stress law enforcement, not agency work. You mentioned how the difficult first few years of the Nixon administration, you know, the low point in '71. How much of the breakthrough was due to issues which meant the Chinese and the Soviet Union were willing to talk? I can't help wonder if low pre-1973 oil prices had an impact in the Soviet Union, but also, of course, the issue of the mooted 1969 nuclear attack by them on China. I mean, was it a coming together of events? Two sides. America had a chance, and the others had a chance.
I do think that when you look at it chronologically, you do recognize that the Nixon administration planted seeds for the types of policies it hoped would come. Nixon, within the first week that he was president, made it clear that he was interested in some change in China policy. Kissinger, though I mentioned in the book, would frequently say that he thought his boss was sort of daydreaming on that one, that it wasn't likely to come. And I give much more credit to Nixon on the China initiative than I do to Kissinger, at least initially. But the muted nuclear attack, for one, certainly got their attention. And it did let them to recognize that both the Soviet Union and China now, there was a possibility of playing them off against each other, but it had to be very carefully done. And I think the Soviets, for example, kept refusing Nixon's efforts to get a summit during 1970. Nixon wanted a summit to help with the political midterm elections, and he could not get one. And I think in a way, they laid the groundwork for it, but the timing and the rest came off really quite extraordinary for them in '71. But luck does require you to have some preparation, and they had done the preparation. And they got a series of incredible breaks, particularly the opening to China, and then the degree to which this distressed the Soviets so much that they quickly agreed to the summit. And really, Nixon and Kissinger did have this triangular diplomacy that they had sought or thought they could get early on.
Yes, sir.
I'm a nobody, but I just want to ask, did he have any affiliation with Edward Luttwak, who wrote Coup d'etat?
I know that he was occasionally sent writings by Luttwak, but I think Luttwak occupied a more conservative view on the Cold War than Kissinger. Kissinger did, though, it's interesting that Kissinger gets material from one of his mentors, Fritz Kramer, who was in the Defense Department and who was a much more conservative figure on the Cold War and even criticized things like the opening to China. So Kissinger was at least aware of the development of a sort of right-wing opposition that was growing to both détente and what was seen as the retrenchment of American power that he would then face when Ronald Reagan would run against Ford in the 1976 primaries. But specifically with Luttwak, I think that he did get materials from Kramer about him.
Do you think that Kissinger's use of the media was sort of a self-aware attempt to create his own legacy, or a sort of legitimate attempt to enact policy in the best way that he could?
I'm not sure that those are contradictory. I think they play on it. In some ways, one can enhance the other. He had a real sense, though, an early sense of the importance of discussing things with journalists. One of the things that highlights is we do know, for example, very clearly that the Nixon administration was very hostile to the press and to the media. And in fact, Spiro Agnew would attack the very television networks of people that Kissinger was always talking to. So it was this odd combination of Kissinger, in effect, connecting with a lot of the people that Nixon was denouncing or that Agnew was denouncing. And I think in that, it also played to Kissinger's own sense that he could carve out an independent existence from Nixon, even though he was very dependent on Nixon for his power and authority early on. And it gave him that opportunity. His overall legacy, the interesting thing about Kissinger and his legacy is it does draw him into a sort of pessimism. When he's asked these questions about his legacy, he feels like he has not successfully convinced Americans, for example, of the need to have a foreign policy more detached from our political battles. I think he actually, even though he was someone who understood that, he came to feel it was something that he would like to see less of. And in that sense, he has a somewhat pessimistic view sometimes of whether he's had a lasting legacy. Although I think on China, he does see that as part of his legacy, and he has been quite outspoken recently in fearing that if tensions develop, you might have a pre-World War I type situation.
Hi, thank you. So for the last 12 years, my employer has been the U.S. government, Department of Defense, and work with Department of State. And what I've sort of observed, or what I felt I've observed, is you have an organization with a lot of capacity, but not really a direction. There's really no overarching strategy. Plenty of power, but not really a rudder. Looking at Henry Kissinger's career, do you see an element, one element, or maybe more than one element of what he brought to the table that might benefit U.S. foreign policy now?
I do, actually. I do think there were aspects, although not in quite the coherent way in which Kissinger sometimes is portrayed as a sort of latter-day Metternich or Bismarck, but I do see particularly his understanding of the need to recognize the limits of what can be done. And I have been impressed, particularly in reading the Martin Indyk book, that in the Middle East, for example, Kissinger recognized what was likely most crucial to the American government, particularly the removal of Egypt as a source of contention between the parties there, and really removing then the larger threat of war, and creating a type of stability. It wasn't perfect by any means, and in fact left lots of problems unresolved, but it did decrease the overall problem of several wars that could have that possibility of superpower confrontation. So I think in some ways it's both recognizing modest achievements for stability are more important perhaps than sweeping peace deals or arrangements, that in many ways a more limited diplomacy that focuses on the solution to key problems in an area rather than sort of a larger framework may make more sense. And that's kind of counterintuitive, because Kissinger is often seen as having this sort of global vision, global strategy, and wanting stability. But I think particularly Indyk in this book on the Middle East does argue that he, at least in applying to the Middle East, followed a more limited conception of what peace would require.
Thank you. In those very early days and Kissinger's secret trip to China, do you think any of the decisions he made still affects the character of the US-China relationship today, beyond obviously them having a relationship?
Well, I do think one of the interesting legacies was, of course, and I think one has to see this in the spirit of the time, was, of course, that Kissinger and Nixon did downplay the importance of Taiwan. In 1971, Taiwan was just another dictatorship in Asia, and to a certain extent, I think both Kissinger and Nixon were not convinced it would survive and become a democratic and prosperous power in the manner in which it has. And to a certain extent, Kissinger in the meetings early on in '71 with Zhou Enlai did minimize American interest in Taiwan in a way that probably he should have recognized. There were certainly strong views on the conservative right about Taiwan, the infamous China lobby, whatever, but there were strong connections to Taiwan that were going to make any sort of change of its status very difficult. And in fact, it would be, and Congress would react quite strongly when Jimmy Carter did recognize the PRC. So I think there has been at least this idea that the United States' commitment to Taiwan is less than solid, is certainly there. And I don't blame Kissinger necessarily, because I think in 1971, given the sort of situation at the time, it wasn't quite clear that it was really necessary to be full-throated in defense of Taiwan, whereas now I would think I'd see it somewhat differently.
I have two questions, and I'm going to ask the difficult one first to make sure I try and get it right. I am James Gow of this parish, by the way. And it's in relation to the new material on AI, where the position seems to be, we've had these things through all of history, and all we need to do is get a grip and take the old approaches to the new phenomenon. And I think I put to 3 of the 6 points he makes. One is opening lines of communication, so going back to Schelling, having lines of communication between great powers so they understand what's going on. The second is reviewing nuclear weapons arsenals because of this link between the new stuff and the old stuff and the dangers that are in there. And the third, which is perhaps the most challenging that I want to point to, but it links to the others, is that one of the points of the new stuff is that it's very fast and it's based on deception, on secrecy. And yet, he seems to advocate for the idea that you slow everything down to make it more transparent. And I just wonder what you make of that, and if you think it's even possible to slow things down to make them more transparent, given that the very nature and purpose is the opposite. The other question goes back to your point about tactical rather than strategic. And I guess it turns on the view that you have that Nixon was more important for China than Kissinger. So I'd just maybe like to get you to explain that a bit more, because I look at it, you mentioned the stuff in 1958. One of the things he really got wrong was tactical nuclear weapons, which he later admitted himself. And at that point, again, marketing as the independent specialist, but really a protege for the army at that stage, promoting ideas. So just maybe can you say a bit more about why Nixon, not Kissinger for China, because that seems like a really big strategic move, and I would have always thought that was his initiative.
On artificial intelligence, I want to probably plead my own technological insufficiency, which was fairly evident right here. On the other hand, what you said about Kissinger wanting to slow things down does amuse me a little bit, because, of course, his own strategies and secrecy, his own connection to that when he was in office was certainly there, and the way in which he also liked using the modern conveniences of his time to react and to undertake policies. I honestly, my own sense there might be of someone who is 98 years old and seeing maybe we should slow things down, that type of thing, more than any profound recognition of some of the dangers that AI poses, or even whether it's practical, whether what he suggests is practical. I plead a certain degree of ignorance on this one. On Nixon and China, It is known, of course, that Richard Nixon in 1967 published his famous article in Foreign Affairs about Asia after Vietnam, and was already then talking about the need to connect with China in some manner. What I meant by, certainly it was a strategic move, but I think it also was something in which Nixon was aware both of the conflict between China and the Soviet Union, but also the degree to which American resistance to communist China, or China as a whole, had faded considerably from the time in late 1950s when he was such a representative of the China lobby, and his own personal sort of political antenna, I would call it, that recognized that a move toward China could hold enormous possibilities in stealing an issue from the Democrats, who were already advocating this and had been outspoken on it, and at the same time would have enormous popular appeal. Because remember again that Vietnam was in part fought because of fears of Chinese expansionism. And in a way, the idea of going to China would undercut, of course, so much of what had been thought to be central to American foreign policy and what many Americans by 1969 and 70 were tired of. And they were tired of the sense of being committed to wars in Asia, and this would offer a tremendous political potential. And what's fascinating in looking through the materials is how often, in the tapes and in other contexts, Nixon references the domestic political impact of China. And I even make the case in my book that one reason the United States takes a really, what I think is a counterproductive position supporting Pakistan in the Pakistan-Indian War is because of fears that it'll lose this connection to China. That China becomes sort of central both as a geostrategic move, but also as the key political move that Nixon sees that's going to allow him to win the presidency again in 1972.
Hi, my name is Vudi, and I'd like to ask you in regards to Kissinger's policy with Syria. Now, as we know, Americans are at war with the Syrians, and pretty much it's the same family they used to be in the time of Kissinger in 1974 and basically 70s, set foot in Syria, tried to negotiate deals and agreements with them. So how would you view current situation of the United States and Syria as something like a long-term failure of the strategy of the Kissinger, or something that American administrations after Kissinger set foot out of the administration somehow didn't or failed to follow up with whatever he thought should be followed? Thank you.
Well, what's fascinating about this is that, of course, in certain respects, the agreement Kissinger got in 1974 of disengagement has lasted to this day. It still defines, in a sense, the border region between Israel and Syria. Even within the Civil War and all the rest, it stayed there. Kissinger had some of his conversations with Assad are both fascinating and very funny on one level, because I make the point in the book that at one of the key conversations, he starts telling Assad about how he's being criticized by all these reporters in America, and he mentions a couple of them and some politicians, and Assad has no idea who he's talking about. And it's clear that this is sort of what Kissinger's indulging in. But eventually they did reach this agreement. I don't think Kissinger had any illusions about Assad. And it is interesting to me that, in a sense, that Israel did follow up on this in the later period, where they came very close to going to actually giving back the Golan Heights, or at least changing the border. And Assad would not agree, in the sense he wanted every inch, and he was quite militant on that. So I'm not sure that I would hold Kissinger as much responsible as I think subsequent administrations didn't realize, in a sense, what they were dealing with all the time with Syria. Even I think the famous Obama red line issue, which Kissinger actually criticized, because he said you can't make statements like that and not follow through. So I think this is one of these cases where I don't think Henry Kissinger's ongoing influence was quite as central as in some others.
So, then we have a final question, I think at the back there.
Okay, I hope this is a good one. If I remember rightly, in his memoirs, Kissinger kind of skips over the Cyprus dispute, claiming that he was too invested with Watergate to really concentrate on what was going on. But thinking about it, at the same time that Cyprus was going on, the Greek dictatorship was falling, and another NATO power, Turkey, invaded Cyprus, and before that, the government under Makarios had also fallen apart. So I really struggle to see whether that's the case. What was sort of the US reaction to, and sort of Kissinger's personal reaction to what was going on in Cyprus, and what was their involvement, if any?
Well, it's fascinating you should ask that. And, I briefly talk about it in the memoir, in my own book, more in the case that it would become, in a way, Kissinger's own success in the Middle East set him up in a situation where other conflicts were seen. He has to play a role. And in a way, I think this was part of the danger of his reputation, because almost immediately he became the target of protests in the United States, particularly a very strong Greek-American lobby that felt he had been overly sympathetic to Turkey. Now, by this point, Kissinger is concerned about the viability of NATO. He's concerned about two NATO countries going to war. He actually favored some type of partition of Cyprus, or he actually didn't favor as much a partition as sort of some degree of ethnic separation that would allow Cyprus to continue to have some degree of unity. It was one of his former international seminar students, though, Echever, am I right? Bullet Echever, who was actually in power then. And I think Kissinger was overly sympathetic to the Turkish position on Cyprus. And of course, this would be the source of one of his first rebukes by Congress, which would pass a cutoff of Turkish military aid. And so while I'm not sure I completely discount Kissinger's point that he was distracted, because in July of 1974, between Watergate, Middle East, and other things, there was a lot on his plate. I do think his own approach to foreign policy and the sense that he had created that he could resolve conflicts played a serious role in some of the criticism he would receive for not intervening earlier and trying to head off the conflict between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus.